The champagne glass slipped from my fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of what I thought was my roommate's boyfriend's penthouse. But as I stared at the lease agreement in my trembling hands, one name stood out in bold letters under property owner, Elena Vasquez. My name. The same penthouse Trevor had been bragging about renting for $8,000 a month was actually mine, inherited from a grandmother I'd never known existed. The same Trevor who had sneered at me just hours earlier, saying I could never afford this lifestyle, had been paying rent to me all along without either of us knowing it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The revelation hit me like a freight train as I stood in the expansive living room of the penthouse, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Just this morning, I had been Maya Chen, the struggling graphic designer who shared a cramped studio apartment with my roommate Jessica, surviving on instant ramen and freelance projects that barely covered my half of the rent. Now, apparently, I was Maya Chen, property owner of one of the most exclusive residential buildings in the city. The journey to this moment had begun 3 weeks earlier when a letter arrived at our tiny apartment addressed to me from the law offices of Morrison, Kent & Associates. I had almost thrown it away, assuming it was another collection notice or some kind of scam. Living paycheck to paycheck as a freelance graphic designer meant I was intimately familiar with bills I couldn't pay and services I couldn't afford. The official letterhead in formal language had screamed legal trouble to me, and I had honestly considered ignoring it entirely. Jessica had been getting ready for another date with Trevor when the letter arrived, applying her makeup with the precision of someone who had never worried about whether she could afford the designer cosmetics scattered across our shared bathroom counter. She came from old money, the kind of family where financial security was as natural as breathing, and her relationship with Trevor fit perfectly into that world of effortless luxury. They met at some charity gala her parents had dragged her to, and from their first date, it was clear that Trevor saw her as the perfect accessory to his carefully curated lifestyle. "Just open it," Jessica had said, catching my hesitation as I held the envelope. "What's the worst that could happen? More debt? You're already broke." Her casual dismissal of my financial situation had stung, but it was nothing new. Jessica had a way of making comments that revealed just how differently we experienced the world, though I don't think she ever meant them maliciously. When you've never had to choose between groceries and rent, it's hard to understand the weight that financial stress carries. The letter inside had been written in dense legal language that made my head spin, but certain phrases jumped out at me like neon signs. Sole beneficiary, estate of Elena Vasquez, substantial assets, and, most confusing of all, immediate action required for inheritance processing. I had read it 3 times before the words began to make any sense, and even then, I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing. Elena Vasquez had been my father's mother, a woman I had never met and barely heard mentioned in my 26 years of life. My father had died when I was 12, and my mother had remarried quickly, seeming eager to leave behind any reminders of her first marriage. Whenever I asked about my father's family, my mother would change the subject or give vague answers about them living far away and not being part of our lives. I had eventually stopped asking, assuming they either didn't exist or didn't want anything to do with us. According to the letter, Elena had been searching for me for years through private investigators and legal channels. She had been estranged from my father before his death due to some family dispute that the letter didn't detail, but she had apparently never stopped wanting to reconnect with her only grandchild. When she passed away 6 months earlier, she had left everything to me, having spent considerable resources tracking me down through adoption records, school enrollment documents, and employment history. The appointment at Morrison, Kent & Associates had been scheduled for the following Tuesday, giving me 3 days to process the impossibility of what I was reading. I spent those days researching Elena Vasquez online, finding surprisingly little information about a woman who had apparently accumulated enough wealth to warrant a law firm's attention. There were a few mentions in local business journals from the 1980s and 1990s, references to real estate investments and property development, but nothing that painted a clear picture of who she had been or how she had built her fortune. Jessica had been surprisingly supportive during those 3 days, offering to come with me to the lawyer's office and speculating endlessly about what kind of inheritance it might be. Maybe it's a house, she had suggested over dinner at our fold-out table that doubled as my desk. Or maybe she had some kind of antique collection. My great-aunt left me a bunch of jewelry that turned out to be worth more than I expected. The possibility that it might be something significant hadn't really occurred to me. In my experience, unexpected news was usually bad news, and windfalls were things that happened to other people. Trevor had been over that Sunday evening when Jessica and I were discussing the mysterious inheritance, and his reaction had been predictably dismissive. He had a way of inserting himself into conversations that didn't concern him, offering opinions that no one had asked for with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything. Trevor worked in finance, something vague involving investment management that he described in terms designed to sound both impressive and incomprehensible. He drove a BMW that was always spotlessly clean, wore suits that cost more than I made in a month, and had the kind of effortless arrogance that comes from never having to worry about money. These inheritance scams are everywhere now, he had said, not bothering to look up from his phone as he spoke. They target people who are desperate for money, promising some dead relative left them a fortune. It's probably going to end up costing you money just to find out it's fake. His dismissive tone had irritated me, but what bothered me more was the assumption that I was desperate enough to fall for a scam. The fact that he wasn't entirely wrong about my financial situation made his comments sting even more. Jessica had defended me, pointing out that the law firm was legitimate and that the letter seemed genuine, but Trevor had just shrugged. Maya seems like a smart girl, but when you're living like this, he had gestured around our tiny apartment with barely concealed disdain, it's easy to believe in fairy tales. No offense, but people in your situation don't usually inherit anything worth inheriting. The casual cruelty of his comment had left me speechless, and Jessica had quickly changed the subject, but his words had echoed in my mind for the rest of the evening. The appointment at Morrison, Kent & Associates had been scheduled for 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, which meant taking time off from a freelance project I couldn't afford to lose. The law firm occupied 3 floors of a downtown Seattle high-rise, the kind of building I usually only saw from the outside when walking to cheaper destinations. The reception area featured marble floors, expensive artwork, and furniture that probably cost more than my annual income. I had felt completely out of place in my best professional outfit, a navy suit I had bought for job interviews 3 years earlier and had worn to every important meeting since. Margaret Morrison, the senior partner handling Elena's estate, had been surprisingly warm and welcoming, nothing like the intimidating legal figure I had been expecting. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she had immediately put me at ease with her genuine smile and offer of coffee or tea. Her office was lined with law books and family photos, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a comfortable study than a sterile legal environment. "Miss Chen, I'm so glad we were finally able to locate you," she had said, as I settled into the leather chair across from her desk. "Your grandmother spent considerable time and resources trying to find you after your father's passing. She regretted the estrangement and wanted very much to be part of your life. But by the time she hired investigators to locate you, your family had moved several times and there were no forwarding addresses." The story Margaret told me filled in gaps in my family history that I hadn't even known existed. Elena Vasquez had immigrated to Seattle from Mexico in the 1960s, with nothing but ambition and an incredible work ethic. She had started by cleaning office buildings at night while learning English during the day, saving every penny she could until she had enough to buy her first property. Over the following decades, she had built a small real estate empire through careful investments, strategic purchases, and an uncanny ability to identify neighborhoods before they became desirable. The dispute with my father had been over his choice to marry my mother and move away from Seattle. Elena had disapproved of the relationship, believing my mother was only interested in what she perceived as my father's family wealth. The argument had escalated into a complete break in communication, with my father refusing to accept any financial help from Elena and declaring that he wanted nothing to do with the family business. When he died unexpectedly in a car accident, Elena had tried to reconnect with my mother and me, but my mother had rebuffed all attempts at contact. "Your grandmother never stopped loving your father or hoping to meet you," Margaret had explained, her voice gentle but professional. She left detailed instructions that if anything happened to her, everything should go to you as her only heir. She felt that the family wealth belonged to the family, regardless of past disagreements. The scope of Elena's estate had been staggering.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The portfolio included 12 residential properties scattered throughout Seattle, from modest apartments in up-and-coming neighborhoods to luxury condominiums in the most exclusive parts of the city. There were commercial properties as well, including several retail spaces and a small office building that generated steady rental income. The total value of the real estate alone was estimated at just over $14 million, but that was only part of the inheritance. Elena had also maintained investment accounts, savings accounts, and a business account for her property management company. The liquid assets totaled another $3.7 million, money that would be transferred to me once all the legal paperwork was completed. There was also a personal account containing detailed records of every property, every tenant, every expense and improvement made over the decades. Elena had been meticulous in her record keeping, leaving me a roadmap for understanding and managing the empire she had built. The most shocking revelation had come when Margaret handed me a thick folder containing current lease agreements for all the properties. I had been scanning through them absently, trying to process the magnitude of what I was inheriting, when one address had jumped out at me like a neon sign. The Penthouse at 1247 Pine Street, the building where Trevor lived and constantly bragged about affording. According to the lease agreement, he was paying $8,000 a month for what he believed was a rental from some faceless property management company. In reality, he had been paying rent to me, though neither of us had known it. The irony was so perfect it felt like something out of a movie. Trevor, who had spent months making subtle and not-so-subtle comments about my financial situation, who had dismissed my inheritance as probably fake, who had suggested that people like me don't inherit anything worth inheriting, had been paying me rent all along. The monthly payments that allowed him to maintain his image of success and sophistication were going directly into accounts that I now owned. Margaret had noticed my reaction to the lease agreement and had pulled out additional documentation about that particular property. The Penthouse was Elena's crown jewel, a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom unit on the top floor of a luxury building she had purchased and converted in the early 2000s. The property had appreciated enormously in value, and the rental income from the Penthouse alone was covering the mortgage payments for 2 of Elena's other properties. Trevor wasn't just renting any expensive apartment. He was renting the most valuable unit in my grandmother's entire portfolio. The legal process of transferring ownership would take several weeks, Margaret had explained, but the rental income would begin flowing to me immediately through the property management company Elena had established. I would need to decide whether to continue using their services or take direct control of the properties, but that decision could wait until I had time to fully understand what I was inheriting. For now, the important thing was that I was officially the owner of a real estate empire I hadn't known existed an hour earlier. Walking out of Morrison, Kent & Associates that Tuesday afternoon, I had felt like I was moving through a dream. The city looked the same, but everything about my relationship to it had fundamentally changed. I owned properties in neighborhoods I had only visited as a tourist. I had rental income that exceeded what I made in an entire year of freelance work. Most importantly, I had the financial security that had been absent from my entire adult life. The peace of mind that comes with knowing you can pay your bills without panic or stress. The bus ride back to the apartment I shared with Jessica had given me time to process what had happened and consider how to share the news. Part of me wanted to keep it secret until the legal transfer was complete, afraid that talking about it might somehow make it disappear. Another part of me was bursting to tell someone, to share the incredible reversal of fortune that had turned my life upside down. I decided to tell Jessica first, knowing that she would be genuinely happy for me and help me figure out how to handle the practical aspects of my new situation. Jessica's reaction had been everything I could have hoped for, and more. She had screamed with excitement, hugged me until I couldn't breathe, and immediately started planning how we should celebrate. "This is incredible," she had said, bouncing around our tiny living room like a child on Christmas morning. "You're rich! You're actually rich! We need to go out. We need to tell everyone. We need to... She had stopped mid-sentence, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. Oh my God, Trevor is going to die when he finds out. He's been so condescending about your money situation. And now, you're probably richer than he is. The thought of Trevor's reaction had been amusing in the abstract, but I hadn't been prepared for how dramatically the dynamic would shift once the news became real. Jessica had insisted on telling him that evening when he came over for dinner. And despite my reservations about making a big announcement before everything was finalized, I had agreed. I was curious to see how someone who had been so dismissive of my circumstances would react to such a dramatic reversal. Trevor had arrived at our apartment that evening carrying takeout from an expensive restaurant, one of his typical gestures that seemed generous but always came with subtle reminders of the cost. I got that salmon you like, he had told Jessica, but I had to order something else for Maya since I know she usually can't afford the entrees there. It was exactly the kind of comment that had irritated me for months, the casual assumption that I couldn't participate in their lifestyle choices because of my financial limitations. Jessica had waited until we were all sitting around our fold-out table before dropping the news. Maya has something incredible to tell you, she had said, her excitement barely contained. Go on, tell him about the inheritance. I had started cautiously, explaining about the letter and the law firm appointment, watching Trevor's expression shift from polite interest to skepticism to something that looked almost like annoyance as the scope of the inheritance became clear. $14 million in real estate? He had repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. Plus almost $4 million in liquid assets? That seems unlikely. Are you sure this law firm is legitimate? These inheritance scams are getting more sophisticated, and they often target people who are financially vulnerable. His immediate assumption that I was being scammed had irritated me, but what bothered me more was the undertone of resentment in his voice, as if my good fortune was somehow a personal affront to him. I had pulled out the paperwork Margaret Morrison had given me, spreading the official documents across our table to prove that this wasn't some elaborate fraud. Trevor had examined them with the careful attention of someone looking for flaws, clearly hoping to find evidence that would support his skepticism. When he couldn't identify any obvious red flags, his expression had grown even more sour. Well, he had said finally, his tone carefully neutral, I guess we'll see what actually materializes once the lawyers get through with everything. These estate transfers can get complicated, and there are often debts or liens that reduce the actual value significantly. He had handed the papers back to me with a dismissive shrug. I wouldn't get too excited until you actually have access to the money and properties. Jessica had tried to lighten the mood by suggesting we celebrate anyway, but Trevor had declined, claiming he had early meetings the next day. His hasty departure had left Jessica and me alone to discuss his strange reaction to what should have been unambiguously good news. He's probably just shocked, Jessica had said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. It's a lot to process. I'm sure he'll be more supportive once he has time to think about it. Over the following weeks, as the legal transfer process moved forward and the reality of my inheritance became undeniable, Trevor's attitude toward me had grown increasingly hostile. He seemed to take every confirmation of my newfound wealth as a personal challenge to his own status and success. When I mentioned that the property management company had transferred the first month's rental income to my new account, totaling just over $43,000, Trevor had actually laughed. $43,000 a month in rental income, he had repeated, shaking his head. That's more than most people make in a year, and you didn't do anything to earn it. At least when I make money, it's because I'm actually working for it. The implication that I didn't deserve my inheritance because I hadn't worked for it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how wealth actually functions, but arguing with Trevor about economic philosophy seemed pointless. The property management company had scheduled a walkthrough of all the inherited properties, giving me my first opportunity to see the physical assets that comprised my new wealth. Margaret Morrison had arranged for Elena's longtime property manager, David Kim, to show me each building and explain the current status of tenants, maintenance needs, and income potential. The tour was scheduled to take place over several days, given the number of properties scattered throughout the city. David Kim was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, who had worked with Elena for over 20 years, managing everything from tenant screening to major renovations. with the efficiency of someone who genuinely cared about maintaining quality properties. He knew every building intimately, could recite the rental history of each unit from memory, and had clearly respected Elena enormously. She was the best property owner I ever worked with, he told me, as we drove to the first building on our list. Fair to tenants but strict about maintaining standards. She always said that if you take care of properties, they'll take care of you. The first several properties were modest apartment buildings in neighborhoods that had gentrified significantly since Elena had purchased them decades earlier. The units were well-maintained, fully occupied, and generating steady income that exceeded the mortgage payments by substantial margins. David explained Elena's investment strategy as we walked through each building. Buy in neighborhoods before they became trendy, maintain the properties meticulously, and charge fair rents that kept good tenants long-term, rather than maximizing short-term profits. It wasn't until the third day of property tours that we reached 1247 Pine Street, the luxury building containing Trevor's penthouse. The building was stunning, a converted warehouse from the 1920s that Elena had transformed into 8 high-end residential units while preserving the industrial architectural details that made it unique. The location was perfect, within walking distance of downtown's best restaurants and shopping, while maintaining a residential feel that attracted long-term tenants willing to pay premium rents. This is your most valuable property, David had explained as we took the elevator to the top floor. The penthouse has been rented to the same tenant for 2 years, and he's been an ideal renter. Always pays on time, takes good care of the space, no complaints from neighbors. He's actually requested to renew his lease early because he loves living here so much. The description of Trevor as an ideal tenant had been amusing, given his attitude toward my financial situation, but I had kept my personal connection to the property to myself. The penthouse itself had been breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains, while exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors created an atmosphere of industrial elegance. The kitchen featured top-of-the-line appliances and custom cabinetry that Elena had installed during the conversion. The master bedroom was larger than my entire current apartment, with a walk-in closet and bathroom that felt more like a spa than a utilitarian space. Standing in the living room where I had attended several of Jessica and Trevor's dinner parties, seeing it now as the property owner rather than an awkward guest who couldn't afford to contribute equally to the expensive wine and catered food, had been surreal. I remembered feeling out of place in this space, intimidated by the obvious wealth it represented and acutely aware of how my discount store clothing and clearance rack accessories marked me as someone who didn't belong in such an environment. David had mentioned that the current tenant was hoping to renew his lease for another 2 years, and that the rental market in the area would support a significant rent increase when the current lease expired. He's paying $8,000 now, but comparable units in the building are going for $10,000 or $11,000. Your grandmother kept his rent low because she valued stability over maximizing income, but you might want to consider bringing it closer to market rate. The knowledge that Trevor was actually getting a discount on what was already an expensive rental had added another layer of irony to the situation. The final stop on our property tour had been Elena's former office, a small suite in one of her commercial buildings where she had managed her real estate empire for the past 15 years. The space was modest but efficiently organized, with filing cabinets containing decades of meticulously maintained records and a desk where Elena had apparently spent most of her working hours. David had given me keys to everything and explained that I could maintain the current management arrangement or take direct control of the properties, whichever felt more comfortable. Sitting at Elena's desk that afternoon, surrounded by evidence of the empire she had built through decades of careful planning and hard work, I had felt a profound connection to the grandmother I had never known. Her investment strategy had been brilliant in its simplicity. Identify undervalued properties in neighborhoods with potential, maintain them to the highest standards, and build relationships with tenants who would take care of the spaces they rented. The result was a portfolio that generated substantial income while requiring minimal day-to-day oversight. The decision to take direct control of the property management had been easy. David Kim was willing to stay on as a consultant, handling maintenance issues and tenant relations, while teaching me the practical aspects of property ownership. I wanted to understand every aspect of what Elena had built, to honor her legacy by continuing the high standards she had established while making the business truly my own. The transition from struggling graphic designer to property owner had been easier than I had expected, largely because Elena had created systems that functioned smoothly with minimal intervention. Rent payments arrived automatically through electronic transfers, maintenance issues were handled by contractors David had worked with for years, and tenant relations were generally positive because of the fair treatment Elena had established as standard practice. For the first time in my adult life, I had financial security that didn't depend on finding the next freelance project or stretching grocery money until payday. Jessica had been incredibly supportive throughout the transition, helping me navigate the practical challenges of managing my new wealth while celebrating every milestone in the process. When the first month's rental income had been deposited into my account, she had insisted we go out for dinner at the expensive restaurant where Trevor usually bought takeout, ordering everything we wanted without checking prices. When I had decided to continue my graphic design work on a selective basis, choosing only projects that interested me rather than accepting anything that paid bills, she had encouraged me to pursue the creative work I was passionate about rather than focusing solely on income generation. Trevor's reaction to my transformation had been increasingly bitter and resentful. He seemed to interpret every aspect of my new financial situation as a personal attack on his own success and status. When I had mentioned that I was considering buying a car to make property management easier, he had made snide comments about people who suddenly came into money making poor financial decisions. When Jessica and I had upgraded to a larger apartment in a nicer neighborhood, he had suggested that I was being irresponsible with money I hadn't earned. The breaking point had come 3 weeks after I officially took control of the property portfolio. Trevor had been complaining about his rent increase, explaining to Jessica that his landlord was raising the monthly payment from $8,000 to $9,500. "It's ridiculous," he had said, his voice full of indignation. "I've been a perfect tenant for 2 years, never missed a payment, never caused any problems, and they're still trying to squeeze more money out of me. These property management companies are all the same, just greedy corporations that don't care about their tenants." I had realized that David Kim had implemented the rent increase we had discussed during the property tour, bringing Trevor's payment closer to market rate while still keeping it below what comparable units commanded. The increase was reasonable and long overdue, but Trevor's reaction revealed how completely disconnected he was from the reality of property ownership and market economics. He seemed to believe that being a good tenant entitled him to below-market rent indefinitely, regardless of rising property values and maintenance costs. "Maybe you should just move somewhere cheaper," I had suggested casually, curious to see how he would respond to the idea of leaving the penthouse he was so proud of living in. "There are lots of nice apartments in the city that cost less than $9,000 a month." Trevor had looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension that I had seen many times before. "Maya, you clearly don't understand how the real estate market works. Quality properties in prime locations command premium rents because they're worth it. I can afford this lifestyle because I've worked hard to build a successful career. Not everyone gets lucky enough to inherit money they didn't earn." The casual cruelty of his comment had been typical Trevor, but this time it had struck me as more ridiculous than hurtful. "You're right," I had said, maintaining a neutral tone despite the anger building inside me. "Not everyone gets lucky enough to inherit $14 million in real estate and a monthly rental income that exceeds most people's annual salaries. It's definitely changed my perspective on what constitutes expensive housing." Trevor had stared at me for a moment, clearly unsure whether I was being sarcastic or genuine. His confusion had been amusing, but what happened next had been even better. Jessica's phone had rung, and she had stepped into the bedroom to take the call, leaving Trevor and me alone in the living room of our new apartment. The space was significantly larger and nicer than our previous place, but still modest compared to Trevor's penthouse. "You know," Trevor had said, settling back into the couch with the comfortable arrogance of someone about to deliver wisdom to someone he considered inferior, "inheriting money is very different from earning it. You might want to be careful about making lifestyle changes too quickly. It's easy to spend inherited wealth faster than you think, especially when you're not used to managing large amounts of money." The patronizing tone had been classic Trevor, but coming from someone who was paying rent to me without knowing it, his financial advice had been particularly absurd. I had been tempted to reveal the connection right then, but something had held me back. The irony was too perfect, and I had realized that I wanted to savor it a little longer before exploding Trevor's carefully constructed world. "You're probably right," I had said instead. "I should be more conservative with my spending until I really understand how much money I actually have access to. It's all still pretty overwhelming." Trevor had nodded approvingly, clearly pleased that I was accepting his guidance. "Exactly. And you should be skeptical of people who suddenly want to be your friend now that you have money. Wealth changes relationships, and not always in good ways. People will try to take advantage of you if you're not careful." The hypocrisy of his warning had been staggering, given how dramatically his own attitude toward me had shifted once my financial situation became clear. The conversation had been interrupted by Jessica returning from her phone call, but Trevor's comments had solidified my decision about how to handle the revelation of our business relationship. He clearly saw me as financially naive and socially inferior, someone who needed his guidance to avoid making mistakes with money I didn't deserve to have. The fact that he was lecturing me about wealth management while paying me rent for the privilege of living in my property had been too ironic to resist exploiting. Over the next week, I had worked with David Kim to plan the perfect revelation. Trevor's lease was due for renewal in 6 weeks, which meant we needed to send him the official paperwork soon. David had suggested that I handle the lease renewal personally, as a way of learning more about the tenant relations aspect of property management. It would be a perfect opportunity to introduce myself as his new landlord, while watching his reaction to discovering that the financially struggling roommate he had been condescending to for months was actually his property owner. The plan was simple but devastatingly effective. I would schedule a meeting with Trevor to discuss his lease renewal, introducing myself as the new owner of 1247 Pine Street. I would be professional and courteous, treating him exactly like any other tenant, while letting the reality of our reversed positions speak for itself. The moment when he realized that every condescending comment about my financial situation had been delivered to his actual landlord would be worth months of enduring his insufferable superiority complex. Jessica had been thrilled when I explained the plan, immediately volunteering to help orchestrate the perfect reveal. "This is going to be incredible," she had said, practically bouncing with excitement. "He's been so awful about your money situation, and now he's going to find out that you literally own the apartment he's been bragging about affording. The look on his face is going to be priceless." The meeting had been scheduled for the following Friday evening, ostensibly so Trevor could meet his new landlord and discuss the lease renewal terms. I had told him only that the property had recently changed ownership, and that the new owner wanted to meet all current tenants personally. Trevor had been annoyed by the inconvenience but had agreed to the meeting, grumbling about property management companies that didn't respect tenants' time. David Kim had offered to attend the meeting with me, both for professional support and because he was curious to see how the revelation would unfold. "In 20 years of property management, I've never seen a situation quite like this," he had told me. "Your grandmother would have found this whole thing very amusing. She always said that character reveals itself when people think nobody important is watching." The night before the meeting, I had stood in the penthouse that would soon officially be mine to control, looking around at the space where I had felt so out of place just months earlier. The expensive furniture, the designer accessories, the carefully curated artwork that Trevor had selected to project an image of success and sophistication, all of it existed at my discretion as the property owner. The power dynamic that had made me feel small and inadequate in this space had completely reversed, though Trevor didn't know it yet. Friday evening had arrived with unseasonable clarity, the kind of perfect Seattle weather that made the city feel like the best place in the world to live. I had dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a professional outfit that projected authority without being ostentatious. The goal was to look like a successful property owner, someone who belonged in the luxury real estate world, without giving Trevor any advance warning about what was coming. David Kim had met me in the lobby of 1247 Pine Street, carrying a leather portfolio containing lease documents and property management paperwork. "Are you ready for this?" he had asked, his expression amused but professional. "Once we go upstairs, there's no taking it back. He's gonna know that you own this place, and that he's been paying rent to you all along." I had taken a deep breath, thinking about all the condescending comments, all the dismissive assumptions about my financial capabilities, All the times Trevor had made me feel small and inadequate in social situations where money determined belonging. "I'm ready," I had said, and meant it completely. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt endless, each floor marking another step toward a confrontation that would fundamentally alter the relationship between Trevor and me forever. David Kim stood beside me, reviewing the lease renewal documents one final time, while I tried to calm the nervous energy coursing through my system. This wasn't just about revealing my ownership of the property, it was about reclaiming my dignity from someone who had systematically undermined my confidence for months. Trevor answered the door wearing his usual confident smile, the expression of someone who believed he controlled every situation he encountered. He was dressed in expensive casual wear, the kind of effortlessly coordinated outfit that screamed money without trying too hard. His greeting was polite but slightly impatient, clearly viewing this meeting as an inconvenience he had to tolerate, rather than an important business discussion. "You must be from the property management company," he said, extending his hand to David Kim while barely glancing in my direction. "I'm Trevor Blackwood. I assume this won't take long? I have dinner plans downtown." His automatic assumption that David was the decision-maker revealed everything about Trevor's worldview. In his mind, authority and wealth were naturally masculine, and women were accessories or assistants rather than power players. David Kim shook Trevor's hand professionally but gestured toward me. "Actually, I'd like you to meet Maya Chen, the new owner of this property. I'm just here to facilitate the transition and answer any questions about the building's management." The confusion that flashed across Trevor's face was immediate and profound, as if David had spoken in a foreign language that he couldn't quite process. Trevor's gaze shifted to me with the slow recognition of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "Maya, what are you doing here? Are you working for the property management company now?" His mind was clearly struggling to reconcile my presence with his understanding of property ownership and business relationships. The possibility that I might actually own the building hadn't even occurred to him as a remote possibility. "I'm here because I own this building," I said simply, keeping my voice level and professional despite the satisfaction I felt at watching his expression change. "I inherited it from my grandmother, along with 11 other properties throughout Seattle. David has been helping me understand the business, and part of that process involves meeting personally with current tenants to discuss lease renewals." The silence that followed was deafening. Trevor stood frozen in the doorway, his confident smile fading as the implications of what I had said began to penetrate his consciousness. His eyes moved from my face to David Kim's professional demeanor to the leather portfolio in my hands, clearly searching for some indication that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. "You own this building," he repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense when spoken aloud. "You own the penthouse I'm renting." His voice had lost all its usual arrogance, replaced by something that sounded almost like disbelief mixed with dawning horror. "I own the entire building," I confirmed, stepping into the penthouse I had visited so many times as an uncomfortable guest. "This unit specifically generates $8,000 in monthly rental income, though as David mentioned, comparable properties in the area are commanding significantly higher rents. We'll need to discuss bringing your payment closer to market rates when we renew your lease." Trevor stepped backward into his living room, his usual smooth composure completely shattered. I could see him processing the timeline, remembering every condescending comment he had made about my financial situation, every dismissive remark about people who don't earn their money, every assumption about my inability to understand or afford his lifestyle. The realization that he had been delivering these insults to his actual landlord was visibly overwhelming. "When did you buy this place?" he asked, his voice strained as he tried to find some explanation that would make the situation less catastrophic for his ego. "Recently? After the inheritance?" There was desperate hope in his question, a desire to believe that his months of condescension had occurred before I became his landlord, rather than while I was unknowingly collecting his rent payments. David Kim consulted his documentation before answering. "Miss Chen inherited this property 6 months ago when her grandmother passed away, but the building has been in her family since 2003. All rental payments for the past 2 years have been deposited into accounts that now belong to her. She's been your landlord since the day you moved in, though neither of you knew it at the time." The color drained from Trevor's face as the full scope of his situation became clear. Every rent payment he had proudly made, every time he had boasted about affording this expensive lifestyle, every moment he had felt superior to me because of his financial resources, all of it had been built on the foundation of paying money to the woman he had been patronizing. The irony was so complete it felt like divine justice. I had no idea, Trevor said weakly, sinking into the leather sectional that dominated his living room. The payments go to some management company account. There was never any indication that you were connected to the property. His explanation sounded hollow even to him, a desperate attempt to minimize the embarrassment of having spent months lecturing his landlord about financial responsibility. I took a seat across from him, maintaining the professional demeanor of a property owner conducting business, rather than someone seeking personal revenge. That's how professional property management works, I explained, enjoying the educational opportunity. Tenants interact with management companies rather than individual owners. It protects everyone's privacy and keeps relationships purely business-focused. David Kim opened his portfolio and spread lease renewal documents across the coffee table that I now realized I technically owned, along with everything else in the apartment. Mr. Blackwood, your current lease expires in 6 weeks. Ms. Chen is offering to renew for another year, but there will be some changes to the terms we need to discuss. Trevor's attention snapped to the documents with the intensity of someone facing a potential disaster. Changes? What kind of changes? His voice carried a note of panic that I had never heard before, the sound of someone who suddenly realized how precarious his position actually was. The rent will increase to $9,500 per month, which brings it closer to current market rates for comparable units, David explained matter-of-factly. Ms. Chen's grandmother kept your rent below market value as a courtesy to long-term tenants, but the new ownership wants to align all properties with their actual worth. The increase represented nearly $2,000 more per month, a significant jump that would strain even Trevor's finance industry salary. I watched him calculate the annual impact, his face growing paler as he realized how much this would affect his carefully maintained lifestyle. The expensive dinners, the designer clothes, the luxury car payments, all of it would need to be reconsidered to accommodate the higher housing costs. $9,500, Trevor repeated numbly. That's a substantial increase. Is there any flexibility in that number? The humility in his voice was something I had never experienced from him before. This was Trevor asking for help rather than dispensing unwanted advice, Trevor acknowledging that he might not be able to afford something, rather than assuming his financial superiority. I exchanged glances with David Kim before responding. The increase is actually quite reasonable given current market conditions. Similar penthouses in this neighborhood are renting for $11,000 or $12,000 per month. My grandmother's policy of keeping rents below market rate was generous, but it wasn't sustainable long-term for the property's financial health. Trevor ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of stress that revealed how carefully constructed his confident image actually was. I understand the business rationale, he said carefully, but this is a significant financial adjustment. Would it be possible to phase in the increase over several months rather than implementing it all at once? The request for accommodation was reasonable from a business perspective, but coming from someone who had spent months dismissing my financial struggles and suggesting that I didn't understand money management, it felt deeply ironic. Trevor was asking for exactly the kind of financial flexibility that he had implied I didn't deserve when discussing my inheritance. We could potentially structure a gradual increase, I said, after pretending to consider the request. Perhaps $9,000 for the first 3 months, then $9,250 for the next 3 months, with the full $9,500 taking effect after 6 months. That would give you time to adjust your budget accordingly. The relief on Trevor's face was palpable, though it was tempered by the obvious discomfort of having to negotiate with someone he had considered financially inferior just hours earlier. That would be very helpful, he said quietly. I appreciate your willingness to work with me on this. David Kim made notes on the lease documents while Trevor and I sat in awkward silence. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for months had completely reversed, and neither of us quite knew how to navigate this new reality. Trevor was clearly struggling with the humiliation of having patronized his landlord, while I was discovering that having real power felt very different from simply being right about someone's character. There are a few other changes we need to discuss, David continued, consulting his notes. Ms. Chen is implementing new policies across all her properties to ensure consistent standards and protect property values. There's a revised noise policy, updated guidelines for modifications or decorating, and new requirements for renters' insurance coverage. Trevor nodded along to each point, his usual impulse to question or challenge completely suppressed by his precarious position. The man who had confidently offered unsolicited opinions about everything from my career choices to my financial decisions was now accepting property management policies without a single objection. The transformation was remarkable to witness. "I'll need to review my insurance coverage," Trevor said when David finished explaining the requirements. "My current policy might not meet the new standards." The admission that he might not have adequate coverage was another crack in the image of financial sophistication he had always projected. "David can recommend some good agents who specialize in high-value rental coverage," I offered, maintaining my professional tone despite the growing satisfaction I felt at Trevor's diminished circumstances. "It's important to have proper protection for both the property and your personal belongings." The meeting continued for another hour as we reviewed every aspect of the lease renewal, from maintenance responsibilities to guest policies to lease termination procedures. Trevor signed each document without question, clearly desperate to secure his housing, despite the increased costs and additional restrictions. The man who had lectured me about not understanding the real estate market was now accepting whatever terms I chose to offer. When David Kim finally packed up his documents and declared the business portion of our meeting complete, an uncomfortable silence settled over the Penthouse. Trevor sat staring at the coffee table where he had just signed agreements that would cost him an additional $18,000 per year, while I processed the surreal experience of conducting landlord business with someone who had been dismissing my financial capabilities for months. "Maya," Trevor said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been contrition, "I owe you an apology. I said some things about your inheritance and your financial situation that were inappropriate and wrong. I had no idea about your connection to this property, but that doesn't excuse my behavior." The apology was more than I had expected, but it felt insufficient given the months of condescension and dismissal I had endured. "You said those things because you believed them," I replied. "Finding out that I'm your landlord doesn't change your fundamental attitude toward people you perceive as having less money or status than you do." Trevor flinched at my directness, but he didn't try to contradict my assessment. "You're right," he admitted. "I made assumptions about you based on your financial situation, and I treated you as if your worth as a person was determined by your bank account. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." David Kim tactfully excused himself to wait in the lobby, giving Trevor and me privacy to address the personal aspects of our reversed relationship. Once we were alone, the facade of professional property management fell away, leaving us to confront the reality of how dramatically our dynamic had shifted. "For what it's worth," Trevor continued, "you've handled this situation with more grace than I probably would have in your position. You could have humiliated me or used this revelation to get back at me for all the things I said. Instead, you've been professional and fair about the business aspects." His acknowledgement of my restraint was accurate but incomplete. The truth was that humiliating Trevor publicly would have been satisfying in the moment but ultimately empty. Having actual power over his housing situation was far more meaningful than any verbal revenge could have been. The ability to determine his living costs and housing security represented a fundamental shift in our relationship that no insult could match. "I'm not interested in humiliating you," I said honestly, "but I am interested in seeing whether this experience changes how you treat people you perceive as having less than you do. Your assumptions about my financial capabilities were wrong, but your attitude toward people you consider financially inferior was the real problem." Trevor nodded thoughtfully, seeming to genuinely consider my point rather than simply waiting for the conversation to end. "You're absolutely right. I've always equated financial success with personal worth, and I've been condescending to people who don't have the same resources I do. This situation has made me realize how ugly that attitude really is. The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction Trevor and I had ever had. Without the buffer of assumed financial superiority, he was forced to engage with me as an equal, and the difference was remarkable. He asked thoughtful questions about my plans for the property portfolio, expressed genuine curiosity about my grandmother's investment strategy, and admitted to having a limited understanding of real estate despite his confident pronouncements about market conditions. "Can I ask you something?" Trevor said as our conversation wound down. "When you first found out about the inheritance, did you know about this connection? Did you know I was paying rent to you?" I shook my head. "I had no idea until I saw your lease agreement during the property tour. It was complete coincidence. But when I realized the connection, I have to admit it felt like poetic justice. You had been so dismissive of my inheritance, suggesting it was probably fake or worthless, and it turned out you were literally paying me rent the entire time." Trevor laughed ruefully, a sound that contained more genuine emotion than any of his usual confident chuckling. "The irony is incredible. I spent months lecturing you about financial responsibility while unknowingly paying rent to fund your actual financial independence. If this were a movie, critics would say it was too unrealistic." The acknowledgement of irony felt like a small step toward genuine self-awareness, though I remained skeptical about whether Trevor's humiliation would translate into lasting change in his attitudes toward money and social status. People who define themselves by their perceived superiority often struggle to maintain new perspectives once the immediate consequences of their behavior fade. "What happens now?" Trevor asked as I prepared to leave. "I mean, beyond the lease renewal and rent increase, are you going to tell Jessica about this? Will this change how we interact when I'm over at your apartment?" The questions revealed Trevor's concern about his social standing within our small circle, his worry that this revelation would permanently damage his image as successful and financially sophisticated. The fear of social consequences seemed to matter more to him than the actual financial impact of the rent increase. "Jessica already knows," I admitted. "She was there when I found your lease agreement and the inheritance documents. She's actually been looking forward to this meeting more than I have." Trevor's expression suggested that he was beginning to understand the full scope of how his assumptions and behavior had been perceived by others. "And as for how we interact going forward," I continued, "that depends on whether you've actually learned something from this experience, or if you're just embarrassed about being caught. I'm not interested in holding this over your head indefinitely, but I'm also not going to pretend that your attitude toward money and social status hasn't been problematic." Trevor was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of my words. "I think I have learned something," he said finally. "Or at least, I hope I have. This whole situation has forced me to confront some ugly truths about how I view success and how I treat people. I'd like the chance to prove that I can do better." The sincerity in his voice seemed genuine, though time would tell whether his newfound humility would survive the embarrassment of this revelation. People often express regret when faced with immediate consequences for their behavior, but maintaining new attitudes requires sustained effort and genuine belief in the need for change. David Kim returned as our conversation concluded, carrying final copies of the signed lease documents and additional paperwork related to the property management transition. "Miss Chen, I think that covers everything we needed to address today. Mr. Blackwood, you should receive confirmation of your new payment schedule within the next few days." As we prepared to leave, Trevor made one final attempt to salvage some dignity from the situation. "Maya, I know this doesn't change anything about what I said before, but I want you to know that I think your grandmother built something impressive. $14 million in real estate assets represents decades of smart investing and careful management. You're inheriting something that took real skill to create." The compliment felt backhanded, another attempt to minimize the significance of my inheritance by emphasizing that I hadn't earned it myself, but I chose not to address it directly. Trevor's need to maintain some sense of superiority was predictable, and arguing with him about it would only diminish the power dynamic shift I had just achieved. Walking out of the penthouse that evening, I felt a profound sense of completion. The months of enduring Trevor's condescension and dismissive comments had been vindicated in the most perfect way possible. He hadn't just been wrong about my financial situation. He had been paying me rent while lecturing me about money management. The irony was so complete, it felt like the universe had orchestrated it specifically for my benefit. David Kim and I rode the elevator down in comfortable silence, both processing what had just occurred. In 20 years of property management, he said as we reached the lobby, I've never seen anything quite like that. Your grandmother would have been very entertained by this whole situation. The comment about Elena made me think about the woman whose careful investing had made this moment possible. She had built her real estate empire through decades of hard work and strategic thinking, creating a foundation that allowed me to reclaim my dignity from someone who had dismissed my worth based on perceived financial status. The inheritance wasn't just money and property. It was the power to control my own narrative and determine my place in social hierarchies. Jessica was waiting at our apartment when I returned, practically vibrating with excitement to hear about the meeting. Tell me everything, she demanded before I had even closed the door. How did he react? What did he say when he realized you own his apartment? Was it as satisfying as we hoped it would be? Recounting the meeting for Jessica allowed me to process the emotional complexity of what had just occurred. The satisfaction of reversing our power dynamic was real and meaningful, but it was tempered by the recognition that Trevor's attitudes toward money and social status were symptoms of larger cultural problems that wouldn't be solved by one humbling experience. He apologized, I told Jessica, and he seemed genuinely embarrassed about his behavior. But I'm not sure if he's actually learned anything meaningful, or if he's just sorry about being caught. People like Trevor often confuse being humiliated with being enlightened. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. At least he can't lecture you about money anymore. Every time he starts to get condescending, you can just remind him that he pays you rent to live in your building. The dynamic had certainly shifted in my favor, though I hoped to use my new power more constructively than simply silencing unwanted advice. Over the following weeks, the change in Trevor's behavior was remarkable and immediate. Gone were the casual comments about my financial situation, the unsolicited advice about money management, and the assumptions about what I could or couldn't afford. In their place was a careful politeness that suggested he was constantly aware of our reversed relationship. The rent increase took effect as scheduled, and Trevor's lifestyle adjustments became apparent almost immediately. The expensive takeout dinners became less frequent, replaced by home cooking that he claimed to enjoy more anyway. His spontaneous shopping trips to high-end stores stopped entirely, and he began checking prices at restaurants before suggesting dinner destinations. The man who had lectured me about people living beyond their means was now experiencing the reality of housing costs that strained his budget. More interesting than Trevor's financial adjustments were the changes in his social behavior. He became noticeably more respectful towards service workers, less dismissive of people in obviously lower-paying jobs, and more thoughtful about making assumptions based on appearance or perceived economic status. Whether these changes represented genuine growth or simply fear of further humiliation remained unclear, but the improvement in his treatment of others was undeniable. The property management aspects of my new role continued to evolve as I learned more about Elena's business philosophy and investment strategies. David Kim proved to be an invaluable mentor, teaching me not just the practical aspects of property ownership, but also the relationship management skills that had made Elena successful. Your grandmother understood that good tenants are assets worth protecting, he explained during one of our weekly meetings. She kept rents fair because stable, long-term tenants cost less than constantly searching for new ones. The principle applied perfectly to Trevor's situation. Despite our personal history and his previous attitude, he was actually an ideal tenant from a business perspective. He paid on time, took care of the property, didn't cause problems with neighbors, and wanted to stay long-term. His personal character flaws were irrelevant to his value as a renter, and maintaining the business relationship served my financial interests regardless of past conflicts. Understanding this distinction between personal and business relationships became crucial as I took on more direct management of Elena's properties. Several other tenants had personality traits or lifestyle choices that I found objectionable, but as long as they fulfilled their lease obligations and maintained the properties appropriately, their personal characteristics were irrelevant to our business relationship. The experience with Trevor had also taught me valuable lessons about power dynamics and social hierarchies. Having actual authority was very different from simply being right about someone's character. The ability to affect Trevor's housing costs and living situation represented real power that commanded respect, regardless of whether he had experienced a genuine change of heart about his social attitudes. This understanding became important as I navigated other aspects of my transformed financial situation. Wealth brought access to social circles and business opportunities that had been closed to me as a struggling graphic designer, but it also attracted people who were interested in my resources rather than my personality or abilities. Learning to distinguish between genuine relationships and opportunistic connections required the same careful evaluation skills that Elena had used in tenant selection. The graphic design work that had once been essential for survival became a creative outlet that I could pursue selectively. Instead of accepting any project that paid bills, I could choose work that interested me and aligned with my values. The financial security provided by rental income allowed me to turn down clients who were difficult to work with or projects that felt meaningless, transforming my relationship with creative work from desperate necessity to genuine passion. Jessica's reaction to my transformation had been entirely positive, but it also revealed some interesting dynamics about our friendship. She had grown up with financial security and had never experienced the stress of wondering whether she could afford basic necessities. My sudden entry into her economic class eliminated a source of difference between us, but it also meant she no longer had the psychological comfort of being the financially stable one in our friendship. The adjustment was subtle but noticeable. Jessica began asking my opinion about financial decisions more frequently, deferring to my judgment about expensive purchases and investment opportunities. The shift from being the friend who needed help to being the friend who could provide it represented a significant change in our relationship dynamic, though it didn't appear to threaten our basic friendship. More challenging was navigating my relationship with my mother and stepfather, who had been largely absent from my life since my father's death, but suddenly became very interested in reconnecting once news of my inheritance reached them. Their renewed attention felt transparently motivated by financial opportunity rather than genuine family affection, creating complicated emotions about obligation and forgiveness. The lawyers handling Elena's estate had prepared me for this possibility, explaining that sudden wealth often brings contact from distant relatives and estranged family members who hope to benefit from someone's good fortune. The decision about how to handle these relationships was entirely mine, but it required careful consideration of motivations and boundaries. My mother's first contact had come through a cheerful email expressing regret about our estrangement and hope that we could rebuild our relationship. The timing, just weeks after news of my inheritance became public through property records, made her motivations transparent. The woman who had dismissed questions about my father's family for over a decade was suddenly interested in discussing family history and maintaining connections. The situation with my mother highlighted one of the unexpected challenges of inherited wealth, distinguishing between people who valued me for myself versus those who valued me for my resources. The same evaluation skills that helped me assess tenant applications and business opportunities became necessary for navigating personal relationships that might be contaminated by financial motivations. David Kim's guidance proved valuable in this area as well. Your grandmother dealt with the same thing, he told me during one of our property visits. Success attracts attention, and not all of it is welcome or genuine. She learned to trust her instincts about people's motivations and to protect herself by maintaining clear boundaries between business and personal relationships. The boundaries became particularly important as word of my property ownership spread through professional and social networks. People who had previously shown little interest in my opinions or company suddenly wanted to discuss real estate investments, seek advice about property management, and propose various business partnerships. The attention was flattering, but required careful evaluation to distinguish legitimate opportunities from attempts to access my resources. One of the most interesting developments was renewed contact from college classmates and former colleagues who had lost touch with me over the years. Social media made it easy for people to track major life changes, and news of my property ownership had apparently reached several people from my past. The sudden interest in reconnecting felt transparently related to my changed financial circumstances, though some of the contacts seemed genuinely pleased about my good fortune, rather than seeking personal benefit. Managing these various relationship challenges while learning property management and adjusting to financial security required developing new skills and perspectives. The woman who had struggled to pay rent just months earlier was now navigating the complex social dynamics that accompany significant wealth. The learning curve was steep, but Elena's documented business practices provided a roadmap for handling both the practical and interpersonal aspects of property ownership. The most unexpected aspect of my transformation was discovering how much I enjoyed the business side of real estate management. Elena's investment strategy had been brilliant in its simplicity, but executing it required constant attention to market conditions, property maintenance, tenant relations, and financial planning. The work-engaged skills I hadn't known I possessed, and provided intellectual challenges that were more stimulating than graphic design projects had ever been. Working with David Kim to analyze potential new acquisitions, I began to understand how Elena had identified undervalued properties in neighborhoods before they became desirable. The process required research, intuition, and risk assessment that made use of analytical abilities I had developed in graphic design but applied to a completely different field. The possibility of expanding Elena's empire through strategic new purchases became an exciting long-term goal. Trevor's lease renewal had proceeded without drama, and his monthly rent payments continued to arrive on schedule, despite the increase. His behavior remained notably more respectful and humble, though whether this represented lasting change or temporary embarrassment remained unclear. The important thing from a business perspective was that he continued to be a reliable tenant who maintained the property and fulfilled his lease obligations. The financial impact of the rent increase across all of Elena's properties was significant, adding over $15,000 per month to the portfolio's income. The additional revenue provided resources for property improvements, new acquisitions, and increased financial security that exceeded even my adjusted expectations for inherited wealth. Elena's conservative approach to rent pricing had left substantial room for bringing payments in line with market rates. Understanding the full scope of Elena's financial acumen required months of studying her investment records and business practices. She had not only identified properties with appreciation potential, but had also timed purchases to take advantage of market downturns and seller desperation. The result was a portfolio that generated substantial income while maintaining significant equity that could be leveraged for future growth. The woman I was becoming bore little resemblance to the financially insecure graphic designer who had struggled to pay rent just months earlier. Confidence in my financial security had transformed my approach to everything from career decisions to social interactions to long-term planning. Having real power in at least one area of my life provided a foundation for developing authority and self-assurance in other areas as well. But the most profound change was in my understanding of how wealth actually functions in society. Before inheriting Elena's empire, I had assumed that financial success was primarily about personal consumption and lifestyle upgrades. Living with substantial assets revealed that real wealth is about power, security, and options rather than expensive possessions or luxury experiences. The ability to affect other people's housing costs, to provide or deny opportunities, to choose whether and how to engage with various relationship dynamics, represented forms of power that were far more meaningful than any material purchase could be. Understanding this distinction helped explain why people like Trevor equated financial resources with personal worth, though it also revealed the limitations of that perspective. As the initial shock of my transformation began to settle into routine, I started planning for the long-term stewardship of Elena's legacy. The properties she had built represented decades of careful work that deserved to be maintained and expanded thoughtfully. The responsibility felt significant but manageable, especially with David Kim's continued guidance and the solid foundation Elena had established. The relationship with Trevor had stabilized into professional courtesy, punctuated by occasional moments of genuine conversation. His humiliation seemed to be fading into acceptance of our reverse dynamic, though his behavior remained notably more respectful than it had been before our revelation. Whether he had learned lasting lessons about social equality or simply adapted to circumstances beyond his control, the practical result was a more pleasant living environment for everyone involved. Looking back on the months since receiving that first letter from Morrison, Kent & Associates, the transformation felt both dramatic and inevitable. Elena's inheritance had provided not just financial security but also the power to control my own narrative and social position. The woman who had once felt intimidated by Trevor's wealth and status was now his landlord, determining his housing costs and living conditions through business decisions that prioritized my financial interests above his personal comfort. The journey from struggling artist to property owner had taught me valuable lessons about the relationship between money and power, the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between business and personal relationships, and the satisfaction that comes from earning respect through demonstrated competence rather than inherited advantage. Elena's legacy was more than just real estate. It was a masterclass in building and maintaining the kind of wealth that provides genuine security and autonomy. 6 months after the lease renewal meeting, I stood in the conference room of Morrison, Kent & Associates, reviewing documents for what would be the largest property acquisition of my developing real estate career. The seller was desperate, a tech entrepreneur whose startup had failed spectacularly, leaving him over-leveraged on a luxury development that he needed to unload quickly. The property was exactly the type of opportunity Elena would have recognized. Prime location, solid construction, temporarily distressed pricing due to the seller's circumstances rather than fundamental problems with the asset itself. Margaret Morrison sat across from me, her experienced eye reviewing the purchase agreement one final time before we finalized the deal. "This is quite an ambitious expansion, Maya. Are you certain you're ready to take on a project of this magnitude?" The development consisted of 24 units across 2 buildings, representing a significant increase in my portfolio's size and complexity. The question was fair, considering that just 18 months earlier I had been struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment. But the months of working with David Kim, studying Elena's investment strategies, and managing increasingly complex business decisions had given me confidence in my ability to evaluate opportunities and execute strategic plans. More importantly, the numbers worked. The seller's desperation had created a pricing opportunity that would generate substantial returns even if the market remained flat. "I've run the projections multiple times," I replied, sliding a detailed financial analysis across the table. "Even in a conservative scenario, this acquisition will increase portfolio income by 37%, while providing significant appreciation potential as the neighborhood continues developing. Elena's investment criteria support this purchase." Margaret nodded approvingly as she reviewed my analysis. The thoroughness of my preparation reflected lessons learned from Elena's meticulous record-keeping and David Kim's patient mentoring. Every assumption was documented, every risk factor identified, every contingency planned for. The due diligence process had taken 3 months, but it had confirmed that this opportunity aligned perfectly with Elena's investment philosophy of buying quality assets during temporary market dislocations. The financing structure was complex but elegant, using equity from existing properties to secure favorable loan terms, while maintaining sufficient cash reserves for unexpected expenses or additional opportunities. The approach balanced leverage with prudence, allowing for aggressive expansion without threatening the stability of the core portfolio. Elena's conservative debt management had created the financial foundation that made such strategic moves possible. Signing the purchase agreement felt like crossing a threshold from property manager to serious real estate investor. The acquisition would make me one of the larger private landlords in the Seattle area, with responsibilities for housing hundreds of people and managing millions of dollars in assets. The transformation from struggling graphic designer to significant property owner was now complete, though the journey had taught me that wealth was about capability and responsibility rather than simply accumulation. David Kim had agreed to oversee the integration of the new properties into our existing management systems, a process that would involve upgrading technology, standardizing procedures, and training additional staff. The expansion required operational sophistication that went beyond the informal systems Elena had used to manage her smaller portfolio. Growth demanded professionalization, but it also created opportunities to implement improvements that would benefit all tenants. The seller's attorney completed the final document review, and we proceeded with the closing process that would transfer ownership of 24 additional rental units to my expanding empire. The magnitude of the transaction was remarkable. In one afternoon, I was acquiring more real estate than most people would own in a lifetime. The financial impact would be transformative, But more importantly, the acquisition represented validation of my ability to identify and execute profitable investments. Walking out of the law firm that afternoon, I reflected on how dramatically my relationship with money and power had evolved since inheriting Elena's original portfolio. The woman who had once felt intimidated by Trevor's casual displays of wealth was now making multi-million-dollar investment decisions with confidence and strategic clarity. The inheritance had provided not just assets, but also the education and experience necessary to build upon Elena's foundation. Trevor's situation had stabilized into a routine that suited both of our interests. He continued paying the increased rent without complaint, maintained the penthouse property to high standards, and had even requested permission to make minor improvements at his own expense. His behavior remained notably more respectful and thoughtful, though whether this represented genuine personal growth or simply adaptation to circumstances remained unclear. From a business perspective, his evolution into an ideal tenant was what mattered most. The most surprising development in Trevor's character was his growing interest in real estate investment, sparked perhaps by his first-hand experience with property ownership dynamics. He had begun asking thoughtful questions about market trends, neighborhood development patterns, and investment strategies during our occasional interactions. His finance background provided useful analytical skills, though his previous arrogance had been replaced by appropriate deference to my superior experience and resources. "I've been thinking about trying to buy something myself," Trevor had mentioned during a recent property maintenance visit. "Maybe a small condo or townhouse where I could build some equity instead of just paying rent." The irony of seeking real estate advice from the woman he had once lectured about financial responsibility was not lost on either of us, but his questions were genuine and his approach appropriately humble. I had provided some general guidance about property evaluation and financing options, maintaining professional boundaries while acknowledging his sincere interest in learning. Trevor's transformation from condescending know-it-all to respectful student illustrated how dramatically power dynamics could shift when underlying assumptions proved incorrect. His experience had apparently taught him valuable lessons about making assumptions based on perceived financial status. Jessica's reaction to my continued success had remained supportive, though the dynamic of our friendship had evolved as my wealth and responsibilities increased. She had initially found the reversal of our financial positions amusing and satisfying, especially given Trevor's previous attitude. But as months passed and my business activities became more demanding, she seemed to struggle with the reality that our lifestyles were diverging in ways that affected our relationship. "You're becoming a different person," Jessica had observed during dinner at an expensive restaurant where I had insisted on paying the check. "More confident, more decisive, but also more distant somehow. It's like you're operating on a different level now." Her comment had been perceptive, reflecting changes that I was still processing myself. The transformation was real and profound. Managing significant assets required developing new skills and perspectives that inevitably affected how I approached all aspects of life. Making decisions that affected hundreds of tenants and millions of dollars in investments demanded a level of analysis and responsibility that changed how I evaluated risks and opportunities. The woman I was becoming had capabilities and obligations that the struggling graphic designer could never have imagined. But the changes weren't just about business acumen or financial resources. Having real power and autonomy had fundamentally altered my relationship with social hierarchies and interpersonal dynamics. I no longer felt the need to seek approval or acceptance from people whose respect was based on perceived status, rather than genuine appreciation for my character or abilities. The security that came with financial independence had liberated me from many of the anxieties and compromises that had previously constrained my choices. This newfound confidence extended beyond business decisions to personal relationships and social situations. At networking events and industry gatherings, I engaged as an equal with other property owners and investors, rather than feeling like an imposter who didn't belong. The authenticity that came from genuine competence and achievement was very different from the borrowed status I had occasionally experienced through association with financially successful people. The contrast with my previous social anxiety was particularly evident during interactions with people who reminded me of Trevor's former attitude toward money and class. When faced with condescension or dismissive behavior based on assumptions about my background or capabilities, I no longer felt the need to prove myself through explanation or justification. Having actual power made other people's opinions about my worthiness largely irrelevant. This shift in perspective had unexpected consequences for my relationship with my mother, who had continued attempting to reconnect after learning about my inheritance. Her efforts had become increasingly transparent in their financial motivations, culminating in a request for a substantial loan to help her and my stepfather purchase a larger house. The conversation that followed had been illuminating for both of us. "I know we haven't been close since your father died," my mother had said during our phone conversation. "But family should help family when they have the resources to do so. You have more money than you could ever spend, and we're still struggling with mortgage payments and credit card debt." Her assumption that my wealth created an obligation to solve her financial problems revealed much about her understanding of both money and family relationships. My response had been firm but not unkind. "My inheritance came from Elena Vasquez, not from our side of the family. You actively prevented me from having a relationship with her, and you've shown no interest in my life until you learned about the money. I don't feel obligated to subsidize lifestyle choices for people who only value me for my financial resources." The boundary setting had been difficult but necessary. The conversation had ended with my mother expressing hurt and disappointment, but it had also clarified the nature of our relationship and my expectations for any future contact. The financial security provided by Elena's inheritance had given me the power to choose which relationships to invest in, based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation or guilt. Not all family connections were worth maintaining, especially when they were contaminated by financial exploitation. Similar boundary setting had been necessary with several other people who had emerged from my past, seeking financial assistance or business opportunities once news of my property ownership became public. The attention was initially flattering but quickly became burdensome, as I realized how many relationships were being redefined by assumptions about my willingness to share resources with anyone who could establish some historical connection. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the relationship between wealth and social dynamics. Money attracted attention, but it didn't automatically create genuine relationships or earn authentic respect. People who were primarily interested in my financial resources rather than my character or abilities were ultimately pursuing a transactional relationship that benefited them more than me. Learning to identify and avoid such connections became an essential skill for protecting both my assets and my emotional well-being. More positive was the development of new relationships within the real estate investment community, where my success was appreciated for its business merit rather than seen as an opportunity for personal benefit. Working with other property owners, contractors, real estate agents, and financial professionals had introduced me to people who shared similar interests and challenges. These connections were based on mutual professional respect rather than assumptions about social status or financial obligations. David Kim had been instrumental in introducing me to this network, leveraging his decades of industry experience to help me establish credibility and build valuable relationships. "Your grandmother understood that real estate is ultimately about people," he had explained during one of our strategic planning sessions. "Properties are just assets, but success depends on relationships with tenants, contractors, other investors, and community leaders." The networking had paid dividends beyond social connection, leading to investment opportunities, partnership possibilities, and market intelligence that would have been difficult to access as an outsider. Being accepted as a serious player in the local real estate market required demonstrating competence and building trust over time. But Elena's reputation and my growing track record had accelerated the process considerably. One of the most satisfying aspects of my transformation was the opportunity to implement improvements that benefited tenants while enhancing property values. Elena's conservative management style had maintained properties to high standards, but there had been opportunities for upgrades that would improve quality of life while supporting rent increases justified by enhanced amenities. The expanded portfolio provided economies of scale that made such improvements financially viable. Working with contractors to install energy-efficient heating systems, upgrade kitchen appliances, and improve common areas had been educational and rewarding. The projects required coordinating multiple vendors, managing budgets, and ensuring minimal disruption to existing tenants, but the results enhanced both property values and tenant satisfaction. Seeing the direct impact of thoughtful investment on people's daily lives made the business aspects of property ownership feel meaningful rather than purely transactional. The success of these improvement projects had led to more ambitious plans for the newly acquired properties, which required more extensive renovation to reach their full potential. The seller's financial distress had resulted in deferred maintenance and outdated fixtures that needed attention before the units could command market rents. The renovation process would be complex and expensive, but the potential returns justified the investment. Managing construction projects across multiple properties simultaneously required developing project management skills that extended far beyond Elena's original investment approach. Coordinating contractors, scheduling work to minimize tenant disruption, obtaining permits, and maintaining quality control demanded constant attention and decisive problem solving. The learning curve was steep, but each completed project increased my confidence and competence. The financial results of my expansion strategy had exceeded even optimistic projections. The combination of bringing existing properties to market rate rents and adding new units to the portfolio had increased monthly income by over 60% within the first year. The cash flow supported additional acquisitions while building reserves for future opportunities and unexpected expenses. Elena's conservative foundation had enabled aggressive but prudent growth that established me as a significant player in the local real estate market. More importantly, the success had validated my ability to honor Elena's legacy while building upon her foundation. The woman who had built her empire from nothing would have appreciated the strategic thinking and careful execution that characterized my expansion efforts. The properties she had accumulated through decades of hard work were being leveraged to create something even larger and more impactful, ensuring that her investment philosophy would continue generating results for decades to come. The recognition of my success within the industry had led to speaking opportunities at real estate investment conferences and networking events. Sharing the story of inheriting Elena's portfolio and building upon her foundation resonated with audiences interested in both investment strategies and personal transformation narratives. The presentations helped establish my credibility while honoring Elena's memory and investment principles. These speaking engagements had also provided platforms for discussing broader issues related to housing affordability, tenant relations, and responsible property management. Having experienced financial insecurity personally, I brought a unique perspective to discussions about balancing profitable investment with fair treatment of renters. The goal was to demonstrate that ethical property management and strong financial returns were not mutually exclusive objectives. Trevor had attended one of my presentations at a downtown Seattle business conference, approaching me afterward with what appeared to be genuine admiration for my transformation and success. "I have to admit, I never would have predicted this outcome when I first met you," he had said, his tone reflecting none of his former condescension. "You've built something really impressive, and you've done it with integrity and professionalism." The compliment felt sincere, representing a dramatic shift from his previous attitude toward my capabilities and potential. Whether his change of heart reflected genuine personal growth or simply pragmatic adaptation to our reversed circumstances, his acknowledgement of my achievements was satisfying. The man who had once dismissed my inheritance as probably fake was now publicly praising my business acumen and strategic thinking. Our relationship had evolved into something resembling mutual respect, though it remained primarily defined by our landlord-tenant connection rather than personal friendship. Trevor continued to be an exemplary renter, and I continued to be a fair and responsive landlord. The professional boundaries worked well for both of us, allowing interaction without the complications that personal relationship might introduce. Jessica had also attended the conference presentation, expressing pride in my success while acknowledging that our friendship had necessarily evolved as our circumstances diverged. "I'm amazed by what you've accomplished," she had said afterward, "but I also miss the version of you who had time for lazy Sunday brunches and spontaneous shopping trips. Success suits you, but it's also changed our dynamic in ways I'm still adjusting to." Her observation was accurate and somewhat melancholy. The demands of managing an expanding real estate portfolio left less time for casual social activities, and the financial disparity between us had created subtle tensions that affected our interactions. We remained friends, but the easy equality that had characterized our relationship when we shared financial struggles had been replaced by something more complex and occasionally awkward. The challenge of maintaining authentic relationships while navigating significant wealth had proven more difficult than I had anticipated. Financial resources created opportunities and solved problems, but they also attracted insincere attention, while potentially isolating me from people who might feel intimidated or resentful about the disparity in our circumstances. Finding genuine connections required careful evaluation of motivations and constant attention to boundary maintenance. But the benefits of financial security and professional success far outweighed these social complications. Having control over my housing situation, career choices, and daily activities had eliminated the constant stress and anxiety that had characterized my previous existence. The peace of mind that came with knowing I could pay bills, handle emergencies, and pursue opportunities without financial constraint was transformative in ways that went beyond material comfort. The ability to make choices based on personal values and long-term objectives, rather than immediate financial necessity, had fundamentally changed how I approached every aspect of life. Career decisions could prioritize passion and purpose over income requirements. Social relationships could be based on mutual enjoyment rather than networking necessity. Living arrangements could reflect personal preferences rather than budget limitations. The autonomy that wealth provided was perhaps its most valuable benefit. Looking back on the 18 months since receiving that first letter from Morrison, Kent & Associates, the journey from struggling graphic designer to successful real estate investor felt both rapid and inevitable. Elena's inheritance had provided the foundation, but building upon her legacy had required developing new skills, perspectives, and capabilities that transformed me into someone I hadn't known I could become. The woman who had once felt intimidated by Trevor's casual displays of wealth was now making investment decisions that affected hundreds of people and generated millions of dollars in annual revenue. The transformation wasn't just about money or property ownership. It was about discovering capabilities and confidence that had been suppressed by financial insecurity and social anxiety. Elena's legacy had unlocked potential that might otherwise have remained undeveloped. Standing in the lobby of my newest property acquisition, watching contractors begin renovation work that would transform outdated units into modern, comfortable homes, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and purpose. The work honored Elena's memory while creating value for tenants, investors, and the broader community. The business was profitable, ethical, and personally fulfilling in ways that my previous career had never been. The success had also created opportunities to give back in meaningful ways. Establishing a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, supporting local affordable housing initiatives, and mentoring other women interested in real estate investment allowed me to share the benefits of my good fortune while building something larger than personal wealth accumulation. Trevor's penthouse had become a symbol of how dramatically circumstances could change and power dynamics could shift. The apartment where I had once felt so out of place was now just one unit in a portfolio that provided both financial security and professional satisfaction. The man who had dismissed my potential based on perceived financial limitations was now paying rent that supported my continued expansion and success. The irony remained satisfying, but it had evolved beyond personal vindication into a broader understanding of how assumptions about worth and capability could be completely wrong. Trevor's mistake hadn't been simply underestimating my specific potential. It had been equating financial circumstances with personal value and social status with inherent worth. The lesson applied far beyond our particular situation. As I prepared to sign the contracts for my next property acquisition, a mixed-use development that would add commercial space to my residential portfolio, I reflected on how Elena would have viewed my stewardship of her legacy. The expansion was ambitious but carefully planned, building upon her foundation while extending into new opportunities that she might not have pursued herself. The decisions were mine now, informed by her principles but adapted to current market conditions and my own vision for the future. The empire she had built through decades of patient accumulation was becoming something larger and more complex, but the core values of fair dealing, strategic thinking, and long-term perspective remained unchanged. David Kim approached with the final documents for the newest acquisition, his expression reflecting pride in how far I had progressed since our first meeting in Elena's modest office. "Your grandmother would be amazed by what you've accomplished," he said, echoing thoughts I had been having myself. "She built something impressive, but you've taken it to a completely different level." The comment was gratifying, but more importantly, it felt accurate. The shy, financially insecure graphic designer, who had inherited Elena's portfolio 18 months earlier, had evolved into a confident, successful businesswoman who could compete effectively in sophisticated markets while maintaining ethical standards and personal integrity. The transformation had been demanding but deeply rewarding. Walking through the city that evening, I passed the building where Jessica and I had shared our cramped studio apartment during my lowest financial period. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else's life, though the lessons learned during that difficult time continued to inform my approach to both business and personal relationships. Understanding financial insecurity from direct experience made me a more empathetic landlord and a more thoughtful investor. The success story had unfolded in ways that seemed almost scripted for maximum irony and satisfaction. The man who had suggested I could never afford his lifestyle was now paying me rent to maintain that same lifestyle. The inheritance he had dismissed as probably fake had become the foundation for a real estate empire that exceeded his own financial achievements. The woman he had considered financially naive was now making investment decisions with sophistication and success that validated Elena's choice of heir. But the most meaningful aspect of the transformation was the discovery of capabilities and confidence that might have remained dormant without Elena's incredible gift. The inheritance had provided more than money and property. It had unlocked potential and created opportunities for growth that extended far beyond financial accumulation. The woman I had become honored Elena's legacy while creating something uniquely my own. As I stood outside the building that contained Trevor's penthouse, looking up at windows that I now owned and controlled, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The path from struggling artist to successful property owner had been unexpected and challenging, but it had led to personal and professional fulfillment that exceeded anything I could have imagined 18 months earlier. The lights in Trevor's apartment were on, indicating he was home from another day at his finance job, probably reviewing his monthly budget to accommodate the rent increase that had slightly strained his carefully maintained lifestyle. The dynamic between us had completely reversed, but both of us had adapted to the new reality in ways that ultimately benefited everyone involved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as my real estate empire continued growing and evolving. There would be properties to evaluate, tenants to serve, contractors to manage, and strategic decisions to make. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, providing both financial rewards and personal fulfillment that made every day feel meaningful and productive. The transformation from Maya Chen, the struggling graphic designer, to Maya Chen, the successful real estate investor, was now complete, but the journey of building upon Elena's legacy had only just begun. The foundation she had provided would support decades of continued growth and success, ensuring that her investment philosophy and business principles would continue generating results long into the future. The inheritance had been a gift that kept giving, providing not just immediate financial security, but the tools and knowledge necessary to build something even more impressive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.